Hi, this is Yiqin. Thanks for being here. This is a new audio/narration project that I'm starting, through which I hope to get better at speaking and through which you could perhaps discover long-form writing that you wouldn't otherwise encounter or finish. This particular episode will be a quick introduction to the motivations behind the project, as well as some personal tribulations, if you will. I hope you find some of them relatable. The primary motivation behind this project is that I noticed a wide gap between how my writing is received and how my speaking is received. I've had mentors, professors tell me that I need to speak in complete sentences and not assume the other party knows what is going on in my head. These comments are very helpful, constructive, but also perplexing because I much rarely get this kind of feedback on my writing. So there must be something specific to speaking that I need to work on. I hope that by practicing in public, I could stick to a more regular practice schedule and also get feedback from other people that might be listening in or watching. I also firmly believe that hearing yourself in the recorded form is the best way to improve. So as terrifying as that may sound, I'm going to listen to myself on repeat. This project will also serve as an audio journal of some kind that I get to listen to many years down the line. I'm pretty sure my accent, cadence of speech, or even probably especially the pitch of my voice will change. It will definitely get lower. So it will be interesting to look back on many years later. The value proposition to you is that you get to enjoy some of the long form articles that I've written, but now in an audio or a visual form. For reasons that we all know, long form writing doesn't get the love that it deserves. So I hope to share the stuff I've worked on more widely through narration. From the creative side, I'm also excited about mixing genres, mixing forms of communication. I'm a firm believer in the idea that the medium is the message, or the form determines the content. If you're a writer, writing poetry versus writing a short story, a novella, a novel, things of different lengths, you necessarily start writing different things. Similarly, in the modern era, if you are making a podcast versus making a short form video or a longer form video, you will be making different content. So the form, the medium almost determines what kind of content will be made. I'm excited about experimenting myself through narrating written pieces that I've already published, but also narrating from bullet points that I've only jotted down in the past hour. We'll see how that goes and we'll see where that takes me creatively. Next, we'll talk about the major differences I've identified between speaking and writing. I will also speculate a bit about why speaking has been a lot more difficult to me when writing seems to come quite naturally. The main difference between speaking and writing is probably that speaking is necessarily linear. And by linear, I mean many different things. For example, when you're speaking, you cannot go back and edit yourself, whereas you can do that easily in writing, especially with the modern processors. A vivid illustration of this contrast is that when you take computer-based versus paper-based aptitude tests, I remember always signing up for the computer-based tests because on the essay section, I could move paragraphs around. I could get rid of entire paragraphs. I could argue the first point, the second point, and then move the second point in front of the first point. It's impossible to do that when you're speaking. I also noticed that I write to discover what I think rather than the other way around. I would have claim A and a few pieces of supporting evidence, but by the time that I get through all the different arguments, all the different counter arguments, etc., I often realize that what I really want to say, right, instead of claim A that I made at the top, is a slight variation. What I really want to say is perhaps B. When you're writing, it's extremely easy to go back to the first paragraph, to the introduction, and simply change what you're trying to say. But when you're speaking, it's impossible to go back and edit yourself. I even had this precise problem happen to me in a recent interview that I did with a podcast host. There, they asked for my opinion on X. I gave an answer, A, but I equivocated because I had never thought through this problem. After 15 or 30 seconds of thinking out loud, I arrived at a different conclusion. I said, okay, maybe it's B. Maybe I think B. For them, it's deeply unsatisfying because I started from place A, but landed at place B. So what should the audience take away? It's very hard to follow. Another way the linearity problem manifests itself is that you can go into a lot of detail in your writing because you could guide readers with a lot of different visual aids. But it's much harder to signpost when you're speaking. I love indented bullet points in writing. I think they are probably the greatest invention ever because you could have, point 1, 2, 3, but under 1, you could have 1.1, 1.1.1, 1.1.2. And in writing or on static pages, you could have section headings. Readers could skip, right? They could go to the next sub point without losing track of where they are in your argument. And on more modern web pages, you could have collapsible, indented bullet points of endless levels. You could have dynamic ways of displaying the content. You could help readers jump back and forth between your different sub-arguments. But of course, it's impossible to do that when you're speaking. At an abstract level, I think there's a fundamental difference between the oral tradition and the writing tradition. Because in writing, you could develop a lot more complicated thoughts. You could have arguments, counter-arguments. You could preemptively refute objections. You could concede by giving credit to arguments from the other side. And I don't think you could do any of this in speaking without losing your audience. In my writing, I also love to signal uncertainty by adding caveats like probably, on average, etc. Or I would say that I don't know enough about this topic or more research needs to be done on this topic. But when you're speaking, you lose your audience very quickly if you include too many of these caveats, which I think are extraordinarily necessary, but I guess it's simply not possible in the oral tradition. I believe that scientific progress wouldn't have been possible if not for human societies developing the writing tradition, because it allows us to express a much richer, a much more complex set of ideas. Another point about linearity is that with writing, you could go on tangents, you could write extremely parenthetically, but you lose your audience very quickly if you don't stick to a main point when you're speaking. I love reading philosophy papers, half-page footnotes. I love reading economics papers that have 10 or 20 interesting appendices. But when you're speaking, you have to boil down everything that you learned, everything that you want to say to 10 or 15 seconds to complete sentences that that the audience can follow in their head without the help of visual aids. So to the extent that writing requires you to bring your wide-ranging thoughts that go in all different directions into a linear narrative, speaking asks for a lot more. The second difference between speaking and writing is the amount of prep that you can do beforehand. Writing is by definition something that you do asynchronously or before the person starts reading. You could sit in front of your computer for hours, months, years even, and then someone in the future would open the document and start reading. But when you're speaking, in some cases, if you're speaking about a subject you're an expert on, for example, a book that you've spent years writing, a paper you spent years revising, in those cases, it's probably more similar to writing because you already know roughly what you were going to say and you have a solid expectation of the questions that you'll be asked if this is an interactive conversation. But in a lot of other cases, for example, if you're called upon to do an interview on a subject that's outside of your narrow field of expertise, or if you need to speak to people in a professional setting, then it's much harder to practice. There are certain things that you can do. For example, the art of doing the small talk could probably be learned beforehand. But in terms of the substance of a professional conversation, it's much harder, and you need to practice those elevator pitches, say, in order to make coherent, cogent arguments in speech. Another difference I noticed between speaking and writing is that when you're writing, you don't need to worry about the pace of delivery. You don't need to worry about how that differs from the pace at which your thoughts are formed. When I listen to my own recordings, I sometimes notice gaps in the middle of a sentence. I think these are places where my thoughts stopped. So I blanked and I wanted to catch up on what I was saying earlier in order to continue. When you're writing, you simply pause writing. You don't add more spaces to the document. You don't add punctuation. You return to the writing process once you clear up your thoughts, or you could edit later. And the way that you punctuate your arguments, or you want to space out your arguments, is through, again, the visual aids that we mentioned earlier, commas, periods, dashes, and section headings. But when you're speaking, the way that you signpost for your audience is, well, some of it is intonation, but it's also the pauses that you take. What I struggle with is that I would pause at places that my thoughts pause, that my thinking pauses. But it's very confusing for the audience because that is not where the logical argument should pause. This incongruence between where I pause in speech and where my thinking pauses, I think is what causes people to misunderstand what I mean or lose track of what I'm saying. I don't have a solution for you, but I'm going to keep practicing and see where that takes me. Part of the incongruence could probably be attributed to the fact that my mind works at different paces than my mouth, but part of it could also be a simple artifact of language. I speak English as a second language and didn't start using it until age 16. I hope to do this audio project in both Chinese and English so that I can figure out how much of my problem should be attributed to the incongruence problem that I mentioned earlier, and how much should be attributed to language. If making the Chinese ones turns out to be a lot easier than the English ones, then I might still be struggling with the English language. If making the English ones turns out to be a lot easier than the Chinese ones, then the problem is probably that I had stopped using Chinese in an academic, professional setting a long time ago. Hence, I lost the ability to speak in Chinese in a professional manner. The two languages are the same in terms of word order. They're both subject, verb, object. But in terms of the order in which you string up the main and subordinate clauses, the way that tenses are used or cases are used, the two languages are very different. I also mix up he and she a lot in English because they're homonyms. So there are lots of ways that things could go wrong, or lots of reasons I might need some time to come up with a complete sentence in my head and then say it out loud. If making Chinese and English recordings turns out to be equally difficult, then the problem is the incongruence that we mentioned earlier. The problem is probably a lack of speaking practice. I will, of course, randomize or alternate the order in which I record the Chinese content and the English content so that there's not any confounding variable that's being introduced. Having read a lot of the literature on the gender confidence gap, I also wonder to what extent my self-confidence plays a role. Social scientists find a pretty consistent gender gap in self-assessment across countries in different settings. Conditional on skill or performance, women have lower self-assessments than men, with men being overconfident. I even noticed this in the surveys that I've run in both China and the US. On those surveys, we have a standard political knowledge question, and one is asked in the self-assessment manner. You ask people to rate themselves on a scale of 1 to 4 or 1 to 5. A different list of questions are factual ones that quiz people on their political knowledge. What we find is that pretty consistently, conditional on having gotten the same number of quiz questions right, women have, on average, a self-assessment that's 1 point lower on a 4 or 5 point scale than men. There's a separate literature on why you might not want to include a don't know option in your multiple choice question, or you might not let people skip a multiple choice. And that's because men are found to be, again, on average, more likely to guess if they don't know. And women, on the other hand, are more likely to select don't knows or skip the question if they're unsure, if there's any uncertainty about the answer. So the gender gap in political knowledge or the PISA international test scores might overstate the gender difference if men are more likely to make guesses, and you allow people to say they don't know if they're unsure. To recap, I've shared some of the major differences I've identified between speaking and writing. I've also shared some of my own speculations about why speaking might be difficult for quote-unquote a writer. I certainly hope to get better through practice, and I hope to create some value for you in the meantime as well. Hi, this is Editor Yiqin from Day 2. On Day 1, I had 2 recording sessions, and I noticed a pretty big improvement on my second attempt. There was still a lot of editing that I had to do in the end, but I hope that with practice, I'll get to do less and less editing over time. Something else I noticed is that I love referencing academic papers and statistics. I will be linking all the papers that I referenced in this episode in the description. And in the future, to hold myself to a higher standard, I think I will spend more time memorizing the big established findings in the fields that I'm familiar with, as well as the magnitude of the study effects. In the past, I've dismissed rote memorization because, of course, this is not how you learn. But now I'm realizing that maybe the reason human intelligence still trumps large language models, which are the closest that we have to machine intelligence, the reason that human intelligence trumps machine intelligence is that humans can draw connections between concepts that were never connected before, or when new situations arise, or when new pieces of information come to light. And unless we have a solid foundation of the basic facts, the basic established findings, there's no way that we can draw these new connections. And here's the last comment that I will make about this meta recording exercise, just for those of you that are sticking till the very end. I think my view of what natural human speech should sound like has been distorted by the fact that I play video and audio at 1.5x speed. If you listen to the great orators of history, most recently Barack Obama, I guess, they certainly don't speak at 1.5x speed or even 1.2x speed. But my brain has been conditioned to listen to voices that have been played at those speeds. And hence I put a lot of pressure on myself to speak at those paces rather than taking my time. So if you're also interested in getting better at speaking, the lowest hanging fruit is probably to take your time to slow down so that you don't need to add those filler words. Thanks for going on this journey with me and helping me practice in public. If you're interested in the Chinese version of this recording, it will show up probably sometime later on a different feed. The channel name will be the same except for the letters CN rather than EN in brackets. Thanks so much. And if you are shy about speaking, or if you want to get better at speaking, maybe you could join this practice as well.